This week on Past and Presents, we're leaving the college part of the Bethel campus and diving a little bit deeper into the history of the institution. Bethel started as a Swedish Baptist immigrant seminary. We'll talk more about the seminary later, but we should start by talking about the Swedish Baptist immigrant experience. Swedes came across the Atlantic Ocean in huge numbers between 1850 and 1930, about 1.25 million in that time period. Some of them were seeking economic opportunity. Some of them were actually trying to dodge the draft at the time. The people who founded this place largely were fleeing religious persecution. Because they were Baptists, they didn't fit very well into the state church system. They were hounded out of Sweden and started to found churches in the Midwest, especially in the early 1850s. So Minnesota is one of the early centers of what became the Baptist General Conference. And this, behind me, is the oldest extant church from the Swedish Baptists of Minnesota. This is what's called Scandia Chapel. It was originally set up in 1857 near Lake Waconia, Minnesota. Originally, the congregation simply met on Andrew Peterson's farm, and then they gradually built this building. So it started as just kind of a log structure, then they added the steeple and the other features. So it now stands on the campus of the seminary. It moved up here in 1973. They put it on a flatbed truck and moved it up and had a ceremony to rededicate it. But it is one of the oldest surviving churches in the state of Minnesota, and a good reminder of our roots as we go about our business here in the 21st century. Up the hill from the college part of Bethel University's campus in Arney Hills. We're at Bethel Seminary's campus. We'll go inside later on in the episode to visit the library and go to the archives, where our own Diana Magnuson is the archivist. But this seems like a good moment to stop and talk about the history of Bethel and its very origins in 1871 in Chicago in the wake of the Great Fire. Before Bethel was a college, junior college, an academy, it was a seminary, and a very small one. It started in 1871 under the leadership of John Alexis Edgren, a Swedish immigrant, a sailor turned Baptist pastor, and just one student actually that very first year, and it grew slowly. It had kind of a peripatetic existence. In 1884, the seminary, just the Swedish Baptist Theological Seminary, moved to St. Paul, down on, I think, 7th Street in St. Paul. It was in Nebraska for a couple of years, then moved back to Chicago, where it was part of the University of Chicago as kind of the Swedish Baptist department, and then finally moved back up to Minnesota, to the campus that we'll visit as Past and Presents continues on in a couple of weeks. So it's a good place to remember. This actually, the seminary moved to the Arden Hills campus in 1966, 5 years after they bought the land, and 6 years before the college followed suit. There just wasn't enough money, but the seminary kind of paved the way. So it's really the origins of Bethel, and certainly there's still connections between the college and seminary today. People like me who come up here to do research, or students who come back for seminary. Some professors teach across the boundaries between units. Okay, let's continue with our episode for this week as we start another faculty conversation on Past and Presents. So this is part 2 of an extended conversation. Last week we talked to Diana Magnuson and AnneMarie Kooistra about secondary sources primarily. Today we get to dive into what I think really gets us excited, which is the nature of doing original research and using primary sources. At various points already in the semester, we've talked about the way that historians use evidence, and maybe that's one way that we're distinguished from other scholars who study the nature of the evidence we use, the nature of the methods to interpret that evidence and gather it. Let's start then with definitions again. What is a primary source as opposed to a secondary source? And then we'll talk about examples maybe of them. But in broad strokes, how do you know something is a primary source?
I guess what I tell my students is that it's first, it's closest to an event, to an experience. So it's not necessarily a person, but it could be an artifact. It could be something that was, created in that time period. And it might not necessarily be it's just closest, because it might not even be a person who experienced the event, but maybe it's a person who lived in that time period, and this is the only evidence we have from that period. This person was commenting on it. So it's first, it's closest, primary.
So it could be eyewitness account, but it could also just be proximity to event that makes it primary source.
Period, yeah.
Right. I think a point of confusion sometimes I get with students is they assume primary equals best, most reliable. Like, well, I just want to get to the primary sources, skip the secondaries. What are some of the things to be cautious of when engaging primary sources?
Well, a great primary source is a diary of a person who's living at the time that you're trying to study. Well, that's a great source, except that it's also just one person in one moment, and it doesn't represent necessarily a diversity of other people who are also experiencing that moment or have something to say about that. So it's a great source, but it's just a teeny tiny piece of a much larger issue.
Well, and I say to students, they're like, well, diary, that must be a great source, a perfect source. And I say to them, well, think about your last postings this week or your last tweets. How honest were they? What kind of perspective were you trying to create on Instagram? What kind of photos do you post? And if this is the only evidence that future scholars have, how might that skew their perspective of your life? So a diarist it's their perspective, but they might be wanting to tell about events in a certain way. So
yeah, there can be a kind of immediacy to some of these sources that makes you think, well, maybe they're actually revealing something about themselves. There's also a degree to which it's constructed, and you're very conscious of your image. Yeah. And also, I sometimes in senior sem have showed articles from legal journals talking about eyewitness testimony, because we assume, well, that's it. If you got eyewitness cases, turns out they're actually highly unreliable and they're not even trying to be dishonest, but they've got a certain perspective and they're missing everything. The same thing happens with primary sources too. And yet we make students read them because what is valuable? Why is it so important for students not just to read another historian's interpretation of it, but actually to dive into the evidence themselves? And even 200 level courses, we have them start engaging with those sources. Why do we do that?
Well, I love primary sources, and I mean, just when you were introducing this segment, my heart starts to pound because, to me, this is a person's life. This is their experience. This is them speaking to us out of the past. And in my classes, we read them out loud together, not necessarily in their entirety, but we read them out loud because this is their voice. This is what is left of them and their experience. And so I think even if it is a diary or whatever it is, you want to have a variety of sources, but you want to hear from that person, their perspective. Why do they think that? Why do they have so much pain in this? Or why do they find this wrong or funny or confusing? Or, I think that's extremely helpful to hear that voice, just to hear their vocabulary, how their word choice. When we read Mary Rowlandson, she's really, really difficult. And I tell my students, this is the hardest thing you will read all semester because of her word choice, because of how she sees her world is so different from our own. But I think that's really, really valuable.
And I think, too, so in American Civ, sometimes I have them read depositions that were taken about the Boston Massacre. And this is one of these topics, they've heard in 5th grade history, they've heard in junior high, they've heard in high school, and then when they're reading the conflicting testimonies about actually what did happen, and they compare that to the Paul Revere engraving, that's clearly propaganda, all of a sudden they realize, this was actually a lot more complicated than what I thought it was. And that's really, really fun from the teaching point of view, because then that also maybe helps them realize that things today are just as complicated and,
Right. You two have talked about a couple of different kinds of primary sources. So maybe you're going to talk more about one you've already mentioned or a new one. But as you think about courses you teach, what's a favorite kind of primary source, even a specific primary source where you just kind of walk into class delighted that you're going to be working with this primary source today?
I have a primary source that I used in History of Sexuality, which was it was a letter that was written from one woman who had recently gotten married to a friend, a female friend. And when you read the letter straight through, she sort of reports on, it's a fine marriage, the husband seems great. But then as you're reading through it, if you just read every other line, it's actually like a hidden message to her friend. And so it's very interesting because then you realize, in fact, the marriage isn't fantastic. And she actually has to work really hard to communicate the truth in such a way that her husband, who probably is seeing the letter, can't see. So it's a very interesting exercise in sort of resilience, the need to communicate, the complexity again of person's life. So I really enjoy that source, because I think too it's fun because the students sort of read through it and they're, oh, okay, so it's a fine marriage, and then they're like, oh, yeah. So there's a little more to it. It's fun.
So diaries, letters, depositions.
Oh, and I love court transcripts. I mean, I get to read court transcripts for my research, and that's fascinating. Listening and almost seeing, people interrupting and trying to tell the story that they want to tell versus the one that the lawyers or the judge wants them to tell. I mean, I love that. So.
Well, I'll just use one that I mean is one of my favorites. I have many. Whatever is the one for the day is my favorite, but I like to use census data and census manuscripts, and they tell a story. Those schedules tell a story. What questions are being asked on the schedule? What does that tell us about what were our national concerns? The questions that appear and then drop off and then reappear. Who's doing the enumeration? What do
and
they
the
know?
terminology used.
The terminology, and then what does the data, the aggregate data, show us? And then now, how do we use it so differently than the purpose for which it was collected? I keep reminding students this is for reapportionment, but we never think of that anymore, except when our district is going to lose a seat. But so anyway, I love that primary source, and it's not one that is obvious to students. A takeaway I hope from the class is how much literature can inform our understanding of an experience, of an era. It tends to be not a primary source we look to help us understand what it means to be American. But for example, like Herman Melville in Moby Dick, and again, we don't read the whole thing. We read just selections from that, but surprisingly to students, he has a lot to say about race, and a lot to say about class, and a lot to say about gender identity, and about relationships between men and women in Moby Dick. So that's a great place that we get to look at. Mark Twain is really fun to read. He's a humorist, but he kind of like stares us down and makes us think about questions that would be hard for me to get at in using other types of primary sources. We use Edith Wharton, who writes about the upper class, and so that's really fun to look at as well. I think how much students today have in common with 19th century Americans. I don't know if that surprises them, but maybe that's a comfort in a way. Issues about gender and identity, issues about what it means to be a man or a woman, class issues, religious issues, economic issues, they're all there. And again, Americans were approaching their problems in different ways and coming to different conclusions.
We've moved inside Bethel Seminary to the library at Bethel. We'll actually be going upstairs to visit the archives as we come back from our next segment. But I thought we'd stop outside the Carl H. Lundquist Library to talk about Carl H. Lundquist. This is a portrait of Carl from near the end of his life in 1991 when he was quite ill. And it's kind of a haunting picture, very shadowy and kind of diminished, but really an important figure in the history of Bethel and the Baptist General Conference. Carl was president of Bethel from 1954 until 1982, so among other things, that straddles the move from St. Paul, from the campus we'll be visiting later in the semester, to the present campus here in Ardney Hills. So the longest-serving Bethel president, and in many ways still the most influential Bethel president. I do a lot of history of Bethel in my guise as a researcher, and a lot of it has to do with Carl Lundquist and the way that his, especially pietistic influences, shaped the culture and the philosophy of education here at Bethel. So we'll be going upstairs into the library to visit Diana Magnuson and the archives of the BGC in Bethel later on, but let's continue with past and presents.
I am a Bethel graduate, 1988.
I'm a 1999 Bethel grad.
I'm a teacher at Minnehaha Academy.
I am the pastor of worship and adult ministries here at Church of the Cross.
Mutuality editor and publications coordinator.
I work as an attorney in the business and corporate practice.
English Language Institute, China, in China.
Library director at the College of St. Scholastica.
I'm a history professor at Bethel University.
I was a history major.
I was a Bethel history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
History major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I'm Sam Mulberry. I'm a 1999 Bethel grad. I work as a professor in the history department. I teach CWC, and I also co-direct the Academic Enrichment and Support Center. And I was a history major. My move towards becoming a historian actually came through CWC. I came to Bethel as a computer science major, which in the mid-90s was like the great thing to do. This is just as the internet was starting to happen. And I took CWC as a freshman and really loved the class and decided I wanted to TA for it. So I was TAing for CWC at the beginning of my sophomore year, and doing my classes as a computer science major. And one night before the first exam, I was in the choir room giving a workshop. It was me and about probably 70 freshmen who were taking CWC. And I realized as I was standing up in front of those students that what I was doing there, talking about history, helping them prepare for the exams, was so much more sort of who I was and what I wanted to do than sitting and writing code. So the next day, I met with one of the history professors and sort of talked with him about it, and said, I think I need to change my major to history. And he was really encouraging to me about it. So within a week of that experience, I dropped my computer science major and changed my major to history. So along with being a CWC TA, I was also one of Diana Magnuson's TAs in the history department. And she had two TAs. One was the archive TA, and then I was her office TA. So I was hired, I think, initially because I had taken the social welfare history course. So she wanted a TA who could sort of manage some of her office things, but also could lead workshops on sort of exam reviews for social welfare history. So I did both of those. I had the opportunity to write quizzes, not just to grade quizzes, but to actually do the readings and write quizzes, to grade quizzes, to manage a grade book, to do kind of things to prepare materials for class, and then lead review sessions. My biggest challenge and my most favorite moment at being a TA for Diana Magnuson was she was teaching a course on the history of women in America, and I had never taken the course, and she gave me the study guide that the students had and said, could you put together an exam review? And that's when I realized, I can do this. I can do this history professor thing, really. I can take information, figure out, okay, most of the people on the list I knew, most of the events I knew, but there was some stuff I didn't, so I went in and researched them a little bit and had a great workshop on it. And so that was actually a really great experience, because I feel like she invested a lot in me and gave me the opportunities to try to expand my experiences and figure out kind of what in the realms of history was I interested in doing. One of the decisions that I made when I became a history major was that I didn't become a social studies secondary ed major, because part of me, my big dream was to teach CWC. That's really what I wanted to do. So when I graduated from Bethel, I didn't have an ed degree, so I didn't have sort of a teaching job to try to go after. I hadn't applied to graduate schools yet. I knew I wanted to do something before that. So I applied to a number of volunteer programs like Teach for America and a program through Notre Dame. And as I was waiting to hear back from them, I got a call from a man in New Orleans who said, hey, we have some schools down here and we're looking for some teachers. And he had got my name from these other programs I had applied to. So the day I graduated, I went down to New Orleans. We drove to Mobile, Alabama, and I met with the principal, and this is, I think, a testament to how a good Bethel liberal arts education. I sort of listed all the things I felt like I could do. I said I could teach computers, I could teach math, I could teach history, I could teach literature, I could teach art. And he said, well, we could use an art teacher. So I spent a year as an art teacher in Mobile, Alabama. I lived with 4 elderly Catholic brothers. It was the Catholic Volunteer Program. And while I was there, I applied to graduate schools, and through the help of Diana Magnuson, got into the University of Minnesota. And by my second year at the U of M, I was back at Bethel teaching some small groups in CWC. So again, those professors who had invested so much in me while I was here, that continued to pay off. They helped me get into graduate school. They helped me start working here. So in 2003, when the person who was kind of my mentor as a student left Bethel, the administration at Bethel asked me, would I be willing to sort of step in and both work in CWC and the Ask Office. So really it is tied to those relationships that I had with professors that's led me here. So when I was 24, I kind of had my dream job. I was teaching CWC, and I've been doing it ever since. The best part of my job is that I get to sort of carve out interests of mine, and one of those is media production. So whether it's podcasting, which we started doing back in 2007, or doing animation, doing video production, things like that. That's just really been great, because it's something as a kid I really wanted to do, and I can kind of chase that down and say, okay, well, I can bring that into the classroom. I can find excuses for learning to do that, and being part of Past and Present has really been fun. I've really enjoyed all the travel we ended up doing. So Dr. Gehrz and I spent the summer driving around the cities. We went to Europe. I mean, not just for Past and Presents, but we went to Europe and filmed stuff in Europe. And it's just the idea of being able to film that and bring that into the classroom, put that online for both the students who are taking the course and for people who love history, people who love the history department at Bethel. This just really excites me.
I think that you should take history in the human environment because you get exposure to a discipline of history that really, of the courses that we offer, is the newest discipline. So environmental history has, although the environment has clearly been around forever, the actual study of the environment and the impact that it has on human history is a field that's relatively new. I think students really benefit from taking the particular tools that they learn from the environmental history course as they then can go out and apply them to any of the other subjects that they're going to study. And it becomes an enriching way to sort of look at things from a different perspective, to kind of shift. We're always looking at history as, you know, the human beings that are interacting are in the front, and nature kind of serves as a backdrop. And what the environmental history allows you to do is to say, well, what happens if nature were telling the story? So how do we look at the same stories, but from a completely different perspective that gives us a much better, bigger picture? How you live is determined by where you live. And so at the very beginning of the class, students, we talk about this idea. How have you been formed and shaped by the particular environment that you've lived in? For most of us, that's a struggle. We think it has no impact. And so the initial reaction is to say it doesn't affect anything. But then as we sort of pick it apart, we learn more about it. We realize how much we've been shaped by that environment. And then what the study of environmental history does is it allows us to look at each society and to say, why did these people either achieve the things that they did? When there's a downfall, when societies collapse, what were the factors that contributed to the collapse, and how did the environment shape that? I think that that idea of how you live determines, or how you live is determined by where you live, is a central idea that goes throughout all of it and that students walk away with and say that they'll kind of forever keep thinking about.
We've moved upstairs in the seminary library, and we're now at the History Center archives of the Baptist General Conference and Bethel University in the reading room, I guess, with our archivist, Diana Magnuson. You've actually met Diana already in class, and some of you might have class with her, but she doubles as the director of archives here. Diana, just first, what's the mission of the History Center?
Well, our purpose here is to be a repository of materials of Bethel University and the Baptist General Conference, which is now known as Converge Worldwide. We want to steward these items to make them available for researchers, for students, for our Bethel community. But we're also a dynamic history center. We offer teaching and workshops, and we visit other places to do our work as well. We do on-site work, and we also have a Friends of the History Center, which raises funds and provides educational opportunities for people.
I can let you be a little modest here. Can you tell us what this award is and why you think you received it, at least?
Okay. Well, this is the Baptist History and Heritage Society. It's an award from the Association of Librarians and Archivists of actually Southern Baptists, the Davis C. Woolley Award, and we received it, I think, because of our work primarily with engaging students to do archival work. And in my written proposal for the award, I talked about the kinds of stewarding that we do, but also training students to do that dynamic work of archival curation. And I think they were impressed by that, impressed that not only are our students doing things here in the archive, but also working with Bethel's digital librarian, Kent Gerber. So I think that's why we got the award, because that's unique among our archival repositories, having students do that work with you.
And if students are interested, maybe in working in the archives, they should get in touch with you,
right.
probably.
Well, absolutely. If you're a student who has an interest in archival research, or even if you're not sure what that might be, I would be happy to talk to you about that and give you a tour and give you an opportunity to come and see some of the work that we do.
Okay, we'll be right back to hear more about the archives and maybe dive into the stacks a little bit, but let's continue with past and presents. For the last segment here of our extended conversation about evidence, I thought it would be fun just to talk about doing research. I don't know if this is something that the students in this class are just thrilled, they're chomping at the bit to get into an archive, or they're just dreading this and it's intimidating, but maybe just like almost autobiographically, what like a favorite research experience? What's your favorite archive to visit? Your favorite set of sources to dive into? What does it feel like to do that kind of primary source research that historians love to celebrate?
I feel like Diana should start, because my stuff's in LA, which is a little different. I mean, I would say, just from my limited experience working in archives in Minnesota, the people here are so nice and welcoming. So even though it is kind of intimidating, like it's way less intimidating to do it in Minnesota versus very busy California. But
Well, when you said favorite experience, I'm thinking of my experience at the National Archive in Washington, D.C., and now it's in Maryland where I would go and do my work. But I just enjoyed the experience of going through security and going up the elevator, and it's really old. We were in the original National Archive building, and the research room, the desks are really old. You have this, I have a replica of the lamp in my office. You know, I loved turning on the light. I liked going through the finder's aid, choosing my thing. It was like Christmas, what's it going to be like? What's it going to be like? And having them reel it out to you. But just getting into the sources is just so exciting to, again, be touching these things that people created. I felt like I could have done a whole article on the changes in the paper clip, the way that we affix paper. You know, you have the pin, there's just like the brad, you know, was used, all these different things across the years, penmanship, the way memos are organized, who's doing them. But then just the evidence of trying to build your case for whatever it is you're looking at.
Yeah, I love how physical it is.
Yes.
I remember thinking that about the way you bind documents together, but when I was doing research in World War II era things and going into our national archives, but especially getting to like French and German ones, and what's wrong with this paper? Well, it's discolored, and it's partly because it's aged and it's decayed, but it's also partly because they were out of paper and they're using substitutes for it, and you had some sense of the scarcity there. I think we were talking earlier, I think, Diana, you were talking about the nature of when you study primary sources, it's something that it's come from someone's life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and I've sometimes thought, being a historian, it's like you're encountering relics. In the same way that medieval Christians thought that the saints left behind these physical reminders, and they're imbued with holiness. There's a little bit of a sense, not to make it sound too dramatic, but there's a little bit of a sense of the sacred, of encountering, this is someone that was, it was important to someone, and if each life is sacred and important, it almost makes me a little cautious to just to handle it, but there's something a little bit holy about walking into it.
Well, and to respect, I don't know, I guess I feel like I would love to be able to convey that to students, to be respectful of the past and to approach it with respect. And I'm just kind of laughing about one of the encounters I had that felt like a holy encounter of an enumerator procedural handbook. And we didn't even know these existed. I actually discovered it in the archive, and that was such an exciting moment because I kept thinking this had to exist, but we never could find any evidence of it. And when I came across it, that of course was fun, that finding, but then holding it, this was something that somebody carried around with them and used and consulted, and the real artifact. So it was kind of cool. I know that sounds totally nerdy, but
this is a safer nerd space.
I'd say my experience is so different because for a lot of my work, it's trying to recover people, usually through the lens of other people with very clear agendas. And so I'm trying to find the criminals, basically, and trying to figure out what is their motivation, how are they doing what they're doing, and their voices are often being suppressed. So I guess my favorite moment was when I was reading an appeal, and the difficulty of actually getting access to the appeal in the first place it's a story in and of itself. But I was able to read a madam's letter to the judge about why she should in fact get a new trial and why the trial was a travesty of justice. And that was a unique glimpse. I don't think I actually was able to hear her unmitigated voice until that point. And so that was kind of an interesting experience.
Well, I think those moments of discovery are really important, almost like epiphany kind of moments. Like you've been waiting for, but the flip side of that is there's a lot of scarcity in doing research. And you're sifting through things, and you go days without finding what you want to, and maybe you have to leave and you still haven't found it. So patience seems like an important virtue for historical research.
Right. One of the things that I do, and it works really well in my early American history classes, we listen to several podcasts of historians talking about the process of doing their primary source research. And to a student, they're completely blown away by how long these scholars have been working on this one book. It's 10 years, it's 8 years, it's 15 years, and students are trying to do something in 3 weeks and at the last minute, kind of thing. And they don't realize that it might take you several years going through court transcripts, and then you've got to organize it all, figure out your hierarchy, your structure of that, and that's a whole other thing that is time consuming, that I don't think students think about when they start out on a research project, is how do you handle all your primary source evidence and make it coherent, have it make sense.
And how do you stay
be able
focused?
to look, how do you stay
Because
focused and
everything's
look
so
for
interesting.
patterns?
Yeah.
And you're constantly being drawn
Yeah.
away from things. So.
Well, I think we're getting out of time for this conversation, but I would encourage students to continue the conversation. Like, I'm glad we can film these things, but talk to people like Diana and AnneMarie and Amy and myself. Ask us about the research we do, even if you're not in it. You might just want to learn about the method. I mean, how do you kind of organize that information? How do you stay focused and task? Because I think this is just the tip of the iceberg with all these conversations. We're back in the archives of the History Center. Diana, can you just give us a brief 1-minute tour of what we're seeing around us?
Sure. This is our records room here, and in our room we have biographical materials on people who have served either at Bethel University or in the Baptist General Conference. We also have records of the college in every incarnation of the seminary. There are periodicals and thousands of records on our conference churches, those that are active and not active. There are also the presidential records. There's quite a collection of hymnals that we have here. There are films, there are slides, there are photographs. These are the things that you can see and you can touch. The things that we also have in our collection that you don't see here are things in the digital library. We also have some things in deep storage, but the things that are accessible to our patrons are here in this room and then also in the digital library.
So one thing we should mention to students is this is a really important resource as you do primary source research yourself. And there's actually a scholarship available to students who do, especially senior seminar. So this is early in students' careers, but you want to pitch the Carl J. Carlson Scholarship?
Right. The Carl J. Carlson Scholarship was founded by the Carl J. Carlson family. Carlson was past dean of Bethel Seminary, and the family wanted to encourage juniors and seniors to do research, primary research in the archive. And so, and there are so many topics that you can choose from. If you're not sure what kind of a topic you'd like to do, I'd be happy to talk with you about that. We have examples of students who have done their work here. We also have examples of people who have come from other institutions around our globe who have done their research here. So it's a great resource.
Super. So for a couple of reasons, you should talk to Diane if you're interested either in doing original research or working in archives. This is really a great connection we have for our students. We're to the end of our episode of Past and Presents. We'll be back next week with another episode that'll take us off campus. But for now, students, we'll see you Monday night. Everyone else watching, thanks for watching.
Back, baby, back in time.